Okay. All right. So we're gonna do plant review. We're gonna review the flower again. Then I'm gonna do an introduction to animals, and then I'm gonna go over, like I always do, the assignments that you have due this week. This is what I will say. I pushed plant assignments back until Wednesday. It seemed like you guys had quite a bit of work with count day and everything else going on with the rest of your classes. So I just wanted to make sure you had enough time. So what that means is that with plant assignments pushed back until due Wednesday of this week, your animal assignments are the only assignments you're going to have for this week to do, to be due next Monday. And then next week, the only thing you'll have to do. I'm pretty sure my headphones just died. Can you hear me? Cool. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Um, so the only thing you're going to have to do for next week is your test. Okay. Your test next week and your review. And your review. There we go. Okay. All right, there we go. Sorry. Okay, so next week, the only thing you'll have to do is your review and then your test for next week. Your review is on FlippityNet, so it's a couple different things. You can do flashcards, you can do fill in the blank. There's multiple different ways for you to review with that as that kind of the simulation, and then your test has, I think it has like 48 questions on it, and then I just use the percentage to make it equal 100 points. Your I can't remember. I think your assessments are worth 20% of your grade. So you'll have 3 of them, but as always, the questions will be very, very similar to what you've seen before. Um, they'll be very, very similar to what you've seen before in your quizzes, so you guys should do really, really well. Really well. So, all right, plant review. We're going to go do this word wall. I'm going to point to it, and then you're going to tell me which label goes where as soon as it loads. Okay. All right. And this is in, if you want to practice more, this is in our slideshow, so you can come here and practice whenever you feel like it. This part right down here with this line, what is this part, Brandy? Based on our bubbles that are out there. Oh, you can't see my mouse? Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, you can, okay, there you go. This part right down here, this one that's pointing up to here, what is that part? And if you're like, hey, I don't know that one off the top of my head, and you want to skip to the next part, very good. Receptacle. Awesome. Just say skip and I'll go to the next part of the flower. Okay. All right. What about this one right here? Petal. Good. Okay. All right. We'll come up to here. We have this line down here. What is this like thin green thing right here? Nope. So you have this thin green line that's coming up to this like red bulbous point right here. If you want to label the red part first so that, yep, there you go. I think you got it. Filament, good. And then what's the red? like bulbous part that connects to it. What is this called? Anther, very good. And then what is that whole unit together? Or, in other words, the male reproduction system here? What is this part, this male reproduction system called? Stamen, very good. Yep. Okay. Awesome. Now let's move over to, we'll start up here. Let's start down here. What is this piece inside of this large bulbous piece here? What is this piece inside of it? The whole thing is the ovary. So let's put that one in place. The whole thing is the ovary. And then inside the ovary, where the eggs are called what? What are the eggies on the inside called? The ovule. Yes, good. Okay. All right. And then what about the part that goes up right here? Like it looks like a stem, but it's not. Um, Coming out of the flower. What is that part called? Style. Good. Okay. And then at the very top, what is it called? What is this piece at the very top? Another S one. Another S one. You don't have too many options left. Stigma. Good. And the whole female reproductive unit is, what's the whole female unit reproductive unit called? Pistil. Good. Yes. Okay. And then this leaf like part down here at the bottom is called what? You have one left. Sepal. Good. Okay. Couple things I wanted to point out because they don't, I don't think we covered all of this, or you might not have gone through that link that we had there. So again, stamen, male parts of the reproduction, stay men. That's how I remember male parts. You have the filament. It's a long, skinny part. I think of, it's long and skinny, and I think of a filament inside of a light bulb is also a long and skinny. It's curled, but this one isn't. Okay, but it's a really like a long, thin, skinny piece of wire. So that's how I remember the filament. This is where on the anther, that's where the pollen is going to be. Okay, so that's where the pollen is going to be. That is what the bees or the birds or anything is going to come in contact with. They're going to come and get the pollen from the anther. Okay, and then they're going to transport it either to this same flower or to different flowers. Okay, this stigma right here at the top is very, very, very sticky. Okay, it's very, very, very sticky. And so then when a bee goes, jumps from one flower to the other, even if the bee just has like a little bit of pollen on it, it's going to stick to the stigma. And then that pollen is going to come down here and more or less like impregnate the flower down here. Um, and it's going to create down here in the ovary, these ovules are going to create, this is where the fruiting body is. Legitimately, like this is where the fruit comes. If you were to think about an apple, like apples have flowering trees on them in the springtime, the bees come around, more or less like impregnate the flower, and then it turns into an apple. This is where the apple's going to grow from, right down here. Okay. And it has a few different ones to make sure that it's able to grow the fruiting body. Okay. How I remember the female reproductive is a pistil. I just think that women are pistils, like that's like a saying out there. So that's how I remember the women reproductive system. The receptacles just kind of hard, but I think of it as like A receptacle is also like a trash can. Not to say that flowers are trash, but like everything kind of sits on top of the receptacle. So I think like everything sits in the receptacle, everything sits in the trash can. That's how I remember a receptacle there at the bottom. I don't really know how I remember that the sepal is just a leaf. It's just kind of one of those things that, ovaries, the whole unit. Okay. Even in the female reproductive system, you have the ovary that holds the eggs. Okay. Or the ov. Okay. So the ovary is the whole unit and then holds the ovals on the inside. So that's kind of how I remember those different things. And then just kind of wanted to explain a little more how like the fruiting body of the flower worked there. All right. Now on to animals. This is our final that's not right. This is our final piece of the kingdoms. After this, we will go into cells. And then after learning about cells and the different types of cells and how they work, we will then go into genetics, and that will finish out this semester. We'll finish on genetics, and then next semester we will start off with body systems, and then we'll talk about ecology and work through some things of ecology for next semester. So let's talk about animals, okay? These are the things I think we're most commonly familiar with because we ourselves are animals, so that's how we easily relate to them. Cellular, okay? Without us being multicellular, I don't know how we would survive. They're heterotrophs, meaning, of course, that we get or consume our energy from eating something else, whether that be plants, whether that be animals, whether that be fungi. We get our energy by consuming other organisms. All of our cells are supported by collagen. It's a three-stranded protein that is unique to animals. Collagen helps to keep our skin and our other cells in our body strong, but also elastic, okay, so that we can move. If you remember when we were talking about plants and some of the plant cells, and they have cellulose in the cell wall of the plant, and that keeps them very, very strong to protect them against the elements outside. We need our cells to be more flexible, so that we can be flexible and we can move and go from point A to point B, where obviously plants don't move by themselves and go from point A to point B. So they just need to be really strong to be able to withstand the elements. Couple other things, we have an internal digestive system. Obviously, the plants don't have a digestive system at all. Most of us have, we have a mouth opening followed by specialized tissues, i.e., like your esophagus, your stomach, your large intestine, small intestine, colon, etc. And then finishing with the second opening of your anus, somewhere for products to exit. There are animals that it's all in one and out one. And we'll get to that a little more. You'll learn about some of those characteristics as you go through your assignments this week. We also have reproduction. Animal cells use meiosis. We will talk about that in our next unit, where we have males who produce sperm cells, and then we have females who produce egg cells, and they must at some point meet and bond those two together so that they can then form a zygote, or essentially like an embryo, a baby, so that we can reproduce and go from there. Animals normally reproduce sexually. Some are called hydra and can bud, or some can alternate their sexes. For instance, slugs are hermaphrodites. So a hermaphrodite is an organism that can change its sex. So when you have slugs out, and probably why you see slugs all the time, but when you have slugs like out in your garden and stuff, they can change their sex, so they could be a male or a female, and that because they have both body parts within them, and that allows them to reproduce with either. So if you have a whole group of female slugs out there, half of them will turn into male slugs so that they can reproduce and then expand their population. And that's just a trait that they have. Most animals next have Hox genes, which means we develop from our head to our tail. It's why, if you were to take a look at most animals, yeah, yeah, you'll never look at slugs the same way again. Yep. Um, but Hox genes, if you take a look at most embryos, so if you go and you look at like an elephant, a monkey, a snake, snakes are a little different, but um, a human, and you look at their ultrasound when they're just born, like their baby, like if you've ever seen like a tadpole and how they all kind of look, they all kind of have the same shape, that comes from the Hox gene. Okay, that comes from the Hox gene. They all have this like head and then this tail development. And then obviously from there, they all develop different limbs. But that's all how they kind of all start out. That's just genetics there. Okay, and then there we go. This is that head to tail development for those Hox genes I was talking to you about. Okay, everything kind of looks the same, has the same vertebrae, all those different things. And then the majority of animals are diploid, um, and they do not alternate generations with haploid. They always typically get one set of alleles from each of their parents. Okay, so when males and females meet, male gives sperm, gives half of his genetic information, female gives egg, gives half of her genetic information. They meet, and then they're able to recreate organisms from there. This is essentially why, and we'll get into this more with genetics for sure, but this is essentially why, like, if you have any siblings, this is why you look similar to your siblings, but not identical. Because dad gave only half of his information, and that's not the same half every single time he gives it. And same thing with mom, she only gave half of her information, and it's not the same half every single time she gave it. So that's why you look similar sometimes to your siblings, but not identical. Characteristics that animals have: they have our sense organs: sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch. And then again, talk about how they're modal. They can move from point A to point B, unlike plants, unlike fungi, unlike protists. Okay. Protists, obviously, we talked about kind of having like flagella and things like that that do allow them to go from one place to another. Um, but humans, or not humans, animals in general have a much greater range of motion. All right. So those were the characteristics that they have. Internal digestion, we have reproduction, Hox genes, diploid, sense organs, and modal. Now I want to talk a little bit about their body plans, because you will need to know this and have a great understanding for different body plans to do your assignment this week. You have a whole slideshow in your assignments this week. It's lesson 2. There's no work that needs to be done with that slideshow because there's so much information on it, but you will need to know all of that information to complete your lesson 3 assignment. So I just want you to know that that's out there. A lot of this information that I'm going to talk to you about next is on that slideshow as well. So vertebrates, or in other words, organisms with a backbone, we're vertebrates, for instance, are only 5% of the animals we have here on Earth. 95% of the animals that we have here on Earth are what we call invertebrates, which means they do not have a backbone. Okay? They either have an exoskeleton that protects them, or they're like a worm or a tapeworm or a jellyfish or a starfish or even a butterfly, and they're just kind of soft and squishy and not really well protected. You also can see coral there. Yeah, coral is an animal. Okay. So I think a lot of times when we think of animals, we think of vertebrates. How is coral an animal? It um, eats bacteria and protists and other organisms through a filtration system of the water, goes in and out of it, and it grows. It breathes. I know that's weird, but it does. It breathes in the ocean, and then has some of those other characteristics that we just talked about. It reproduces. It needs other coral with different sexes to be able to reproduce. So yeah, it has all of those characteristics there. Doesn't really have the Hox genes that we've talked about, but has all of those other characteristics. All right, now let's talk a little bit. So, key thing you need to remember here, 95% of the animals on Earth are invertebrates and they do not have a backbone. 5%, probably the 5% that we're most familiar with, are vertebrates, and that means that they have a backbone. Now we'll get into a little bit more of our body plans. Symmetry. Bilateral symmetry means you can cut the organism in half down the length of their body. You can do this for quite a few different organisms out there. Humans, you can do that from us. You cut us from head through our body, and you have two halves to the organism. And they're the same, if not similar, on both sides. Same thing with the lobster here. You can cut the lobster right down the middle, and it's split in half. Okay? Same with an elephant, same with a bird, all sorts of different things like that. Next, you have things that have radial symmetry, which means that, like a radius, like in math, the radii, you can cut from the center and cut it into sorry, multiple lines around the organism. A great example of this is a starfish. Obviously, you start here in the center and you can cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they would all be equal. Okay? All those parts would be equal. Another example of this would be a jellyfish would also have radial symmetry. That would be another one that has radial symmetry. There are some bugs out there that may have radial symmetry, but most of them have bilateral symmetry. They're very rare, but they're out there. And then lastly, you have asymmetrical or unequal symmetry, which means like coral, kind of like what we talked about. They don't have a rhyme or reason to their body plan. There's no distinct way that you can cut them in half or into quarters or into fifths or into thirds. Okay, they don't really have a distinct symmetry there. So they're asymmetrical. Next, you have tissue layers in terms of body plans. So diploplast tissue layers are typically found, diploplast tissue layers are typically found in radial symmetrical organisms. So like the starfish, like the jellyfish, they typically have two tissue layers, which means they have a skin tissue layer and then a nervous system tissue layer, and don't typically have that like inner digestive system tissue layer. It's a little bit different for them. Their nervous system, sorry, that's not what I meant at all. I'm sorry. Their skin and their nervous system is like one, and then they have their digestive system. Okay, but they don't have other complex organs within inside of them. Okay, so they have their skin and nervous system, and then they have their digestive system. So this is right here. This is the diploplast. Then they have this middle layer in here that's non-living. There's really nothing inside of there. They can feel things, they can sense things, and then they're able to digest and eat their food, but that's about it. They're not really complex. Triploblast, that's like us. Us as humans, we are triploblast organisms. Typically more advanced, typically bilateral. They have 3 layers. They have the ectoderm, skin and nervous system on the outside. Then they have the digestive system. And then they have the tissues and organs. Okay, so it's that middle layer in between. So the ectoderm is all the way out here. Endoderm is the most inside thing. And then in between those 2 layers, that's where our heart is. That's where our lungs are. That's where our veins are. That's where our muscles are. That's where all of those different things are in those in between layers. Okay, in the mesoderm is what that's called. So those are the different tissue layers that you're referring to there. And then you have developmental patterns. So you have protozomes, and then you have deuterosomes. So what happens with protozomes is when the cells first start to form, they form their mouth first, and they develop from a blastospore, and then that then creates that internal digestive system and then goes and develops their anus after the fact. Deuterosomes go in the opposite direction. First, they form their anus, and then secondly, they form their mouth. So the protozomes are right here. You see, starts to form their mouth first, and then comes down here and forms their anus. The digestive tube is on the inside. Deuterosomes are on the opposite. It forms their anus first, and then develops and then forms their mouth on the other side. It's just two ways the animals have transitioned and created through evolution to make our digestive systems on the inside of our bodies. That's a lot of like the reason why these cells are the way they are and why we have these different layers is because of this developmental pattern right here. With this developmental pattern, this is kind of what's happened here. So this essentially means, hey, this is where you're going to find all the animals. Our first branch, you're going to have sponges. They're not going to have any tissue layers. Then you have all of the rest of the animals that are going to have tissue layers, right? Okay, so sponges basically can digest food through water filtration system. They can feel a little bit, but not much, and that's about it. Everything else is going to have tissue layers. Jellyfish, again, are going to have that radial symmetry, um, but and there's also coral over there and sea anemones and all the other things, but they haven't developed that internal digestive system, so they're not segmented into these protozoans and deuterosomes. So the protozomes are any organism that has developed their mouth first going to their anus. So here you have flatworms, you have segmented worms, you have mollusks. These will be your snails, these will be your clams, these will also be your slugs. Nematodes, roundworms, these are those typical garden worms you see. And then anything that's an arthropod, that will be any insect, any spider, any sort of crustacean, lobster, crab, etc., etc. Then you have your deuterosomes, those that have radial symmetry, developed anus to mouth first, which will be your sea stars or sea urchins. And then our largest category that we're familiar with, which is chordata, which is anything with a spinal cord, is in the chordata category. Okay, so that's any vertebrate is a deuterosome and has developed anus to mouth. Okay, including ourselves, and that's just part of life. Things to know. Yep, and these are just the two major branches of the phylogenetic tree. Okay, all right. Let me open assignments so we can take a look at those for this week. Again, lesson 2 just has a lot of work in it. So, Okay. Lesson 1, you're going to go over these animal characteristics again. Okay, you're going to go through these characteristics again. And then you have a little bit more information here that I didn't cover today because it's kind of self-explanatory and there's a great video on here for you to watch. But along with animal characteristics, a big thing to know is the way that animals behave as opposed to plants and fungi and everything else. Obviously, we have a solid brain mass that controls our behavior. So that's a big part of what separates animals from the other organisms out there that are also eukaryotes. So you're going to read here a little bit about behavior, then you're going to watch this video on nature versus nurture. And then your assignment for this one is you're going to argue whether you believe that the traits listed, intelligence, personality, weight/obesity, and criminal behavior, come from nature or nurture, and why. So nature means that you're born with that characteristic and that's just the way you're going to be. And then nurture would mean that someone who cared for you, kind of implemented those characteristics inside of you, and you believe that nurture is the reason that someone would take on these. So, like if we addressed criminal behavior, for instance, um, do you believe that people who are criminals just have criminal babies, and why? Or do you believe that if two criminals had a baby and then that baby was adopted and grew up in a separate environment where it was a very stable home, okay, that they would be able to be nurtured out of having criminal behavior? Those are the things that you're going to think of here. Yes, okay. But yeah, so you'll work through each of those. So you'll work through intelligence, you'll work through personality, you'll work through weight and obesity and criminal behavior, and decipher which is what you think. I will tell you right now, this is an ongoing study for all of scientists all over the world. There is no definitive answer, so you're not going to have a wrong answer here, but I would really like your opinion on what you think of each of these. And out there, some scientists will say that some is more controlled by nature and some is more controlled by nurture. But again, you're not going to have a wrong opinion here. I would just like to know what you think after watching that video and then reading a little bit more about behavior. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. Your next assignment, which is not really an assignment, but it is like a significant amount of reading. So I did want to give you time to just kind of read through it. You're going to talk through all of those different body separations that we talked about. And then, okay, so you're going to talk through all these body separations that we talked about. Then you're going to jump into these phyla and you're going to learn a little bit more about each of these phyla. So you have sponges, you'll learn about those. You will learn about the jellyfish, sea anemones, and coral. You will learn about the worms. You will learn about the other worms. You will learn about the mollusks. You will learn about more worms. You will learn about arthropods, essentially an insect or a spider, scorpion, etc., etc. You will learn about the echinodermatas, which are the spiny skinned sea stars, etc. Then you will learn about vertebrates. Okay. So you'll just go through and learn a little bit more about those. But again, there's 18 slides here, so it's just a lot to read through. So I wanted you to be able to understand all of that. And you will need that information to do your classification assignment here for lesson 3 this week. All right, so for this classification assignment, on the first slide, you're going to go to this website and you're going to read about the similarities and differences between two classes of animals in chordata, in amphibians, and reptiles. Okay, then you're going to place an X in a box whether you think it is an amphibian or a reptile based on this characteristic here. This is a big reason why we went over all those characteristics for animals, so that you can understand whether or not you think, based on reading through this website, whether you think these characteristics make them an amphibian or a reptile. You may go through here and go, hey, wait a second, they both lay eggs. So you'll put an X on both sides. You may put an X only on one side. You may put an X nowhere. You may say they don't have any of these things in common. Okay, so you'll just put an X on each side for there. Then you're going to learn and go through and create a cladogram. Essentially, you're going to find common characteristics that link these things together. Okay, and you're going to kind of draw that cladogram there, very similar to the one that you just saw with the different tissue layers and the different phyla. You're going to relate different organisms. So You're going to have a frog, you're going to have a fish, you're going to have a bird, a koala, and a lizard. You're going to take a look at these organisms, and in these blue boxes here, you're going to list any characteristics that you see that you think they have that they may have internally, any personality traits they have that make them similar or different, etc., etc. Anything you can think of, you'll list all those characteristics in those blue boxes. Then on the next page, it's going to ask you to mark whether or not these organisms have a backbone, lungs, an anatomic egg, a chambered heart, or fur. Okay, and so you'll mark those down here, and then you will use the characteristics on slide 4 and the characteristics on slide 5 to then create your cladogram to see how they're related and which ones are more closely related. Obviously, so the fish has a backbone but doesn't have lungs, so it goes down here. Then you're going to type in here the rest of the different organisms, okay, based on, do they have an animate egg? Do they have a four-chambered heart? Do they have fur? Which animal should be all the way up here based on the characteristics that they have and how closely related are they? And that's the work you have for this week. Again, it's more just reading, getting a better understanding of the different organisms for animals. Next week, again, your review and your test. What questions do you have about any of the work this week, last week, next week, etc.? Any questions? None. Okay, cool. No quiz this week because we were going to originally have our test, so the questions about animals will just be on your test next week. So keep that in mind. Don't just pass off the information like, oh, I don't have to know any of this. It's important because there will be questions about animals on your test next week. Okay, that's all I have for you today. If you do have anything else, you know how to get a hold of me. Always here to answer any questions. You're doing great, though. Keep it up. Have a great day. And as always, reach out if you need anything.